Well, good evening, everyone. We are going to get started because it is 7 o'clock. And let's begin with a moment of silence, and we'll offer a prayer to the Lord tonight. O God, all gracious and loving, we thank you for the gift of creation and for your merciful presence in all the ups and downs of human life. We ask you, Lord, to bless us tonight, that your word may enlighten us, that we may follow your path more completely. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so the last few times that we met, I did sort of an overview of how the book of Genesis fits into the Torah and into the whole Old Testament from a Christian point of view. We looked at the first creation narrative in chapter 1, which is probably a priestly narrative which gives the beautiful, well-ordered creation of the world in 7 days. And we come to the very pinnacle of that, and we see that God rested on the seventh day and thus made the seventh day holy. We also saw that God saw everything God had made was very good, and that human beings, male and female, were created in the image and likeness of God. So those are kind of theological high points from that first chapter of Genesis. Last time we gathered, 2 weeks ago, we looked at the second and third chapters. So how God creates human beings, a different source, probably a more ancient narrative from the clay of the earth, and breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and situated Adam in the garden, brought all the animals to Adam to see what he would call them, and then from the rib in his side shaped the woman. And so the beautiful narrative of that intimacy of God with humanity. So a very different focal point than chapter 1, but equally beautiful and profound in its own unique way. And then we saw also last time how that one of the creatures in the garden, the serpent, was the most cunning of all the creatures, and it enticed our human parents to turn aside from the command that God had laid down for them. And we saw the effects of that, how human beings were no longer at home with themselves, covering themselves in shame, no longer at home with each other, blaming one another, no longer at home with creation. The consequences mean that the earth is going to be hard to till and cultivate, and no longer at peace with God, hiding from God. And yet we also saw that God takes the initiative. God walks in the garden looking for them and asks the question, where are you? And in the end clothed both Adam and Eve. He covered their nakedness. So you see the effect of sin, turning aside from God. You see the consequences that flow from that, but you also see God's ongoing tenderness, God's fidelity to his human creatures. So we're going to be starting tonight with the fourth chapter of Genesis. And we're going to be essentially looking at the fourth chapter all the way through the 11th chapter now as sort of an unfolding of the effects of that original turning from God. So one way of looking at that prehistory before Abram is called by God, which describes kind of the universal state of affairs, is to show that from the first turning from God, there was a ripple effect that really ripples out to affect all human beings. And in a sense, you see the deepening of the human condition going lower and lower away from God as those chapters unfold. How many of y'all have been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C.? So, one of the elements about the original, before they put up the second sculpture, was they just had the wall in place. And you start and the wall is low, and as you walk further, the wall gets deeper and deeper, and more names are added to the memorial. And so you get the sense of, like, as you're walking into the war, things are getting darker. It's getting more challenging and difficult. And you get the same ripple effect in these chapters of Genesis. So sort of invited you to look ahead, to read ahead in the text, Did anybody do that from the last time we met? Okay, see a few heads nodding. And did any questions occur to you, or did you notice anything that really struck you as you began to read through those narratives? There's some very interesting tidbits in those chapters. We'll be focusing on them tonight, but
I noticed, and I don't know why this isn't the ages.
yes. Yeah, the dramatic lengths of the ages of those first 10 ancestors, from Adam all the way down to Noah. Yeah, we were talking about it. It's, if you put it all together, it's like 8,000 to 10,000 years. So, but the cultural milieu, by the way, it's interesting, is in the ancient Near East where Genesis was put together, there are lists from other cultures around them, like the Sumerian king list that lists their great kings. And when they list how long their kings lived, they lived tens of thousands of years. So as long as up to 43,200 years, one of their kings lived. So when Israel put together its narrative, it dramatically shortens those very exaggerated high numbers to something more manageable. Nobody lives more than 1,000 years, right? So a couple of lifespans ago, Jesus lived, right? So it is interesting. Did anybody notice when you're reading the text that there is an upper limit God eventually sets?
120.
Yep, you're right. 120. God said, "Oh, that's going to be it. No more than 120." And later in the Psalms, you'll have a reflection on most people only live to be 70 or 80 for those who are strong. And most of these are emptiness and pain, the Psalm says. So it's interesting. Great symbolic import in this part of Genesis, as throughout the Old Testament, to Numbers. So Numbers always have very powerful symbolic. Did any of y'all read ahead all the way through the flood narratives? Okay, so lots of numbers in the flood narratives. We're going to be looking at those next week if we don't get to them tonight. So, but first, I want to drill down into chapter 4 and the narrative that immediately follows the story about Adam and Eve turning from God in the garden, the consequences. The very next chapter continues, in a sense, the descent of human beings into the darkness of the effects of sin, of turning from God. And I'm going to just start in the Hebrew Bible. I actually read these texts tonight from the Hebrew Bible. There's some beautiful ways that the Hebrew Bible describes things. With the story of the book of Genesis and the flood story, it's the New American Bible says God regretted that he made human beings because of the evil they were doing, and his heart was grieved. The Hebrew Bible says God regretted that he had made them, and his heart was saddened. And I thought that word saddened is kind of an evocative word in English. All right, so chapter 4, verse 1. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. She then bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you distressed? And why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master. How did that sound compared to your text in front of you? Anybody want to read? Anybody have the New American Bible? Want to read that same little section real quick, since it's the one we use in liturgy?
I got Ignatius Press.
That's probably the New American, I'm guessing.
Okay. Well, this one says, Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought some of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell.
I kind of like the fact that he's angry in this one, not just distressed. Yeah, good.
The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
Okay, so questions that come up in your minds as you hear that first little introduction to the story of the first two sons of Adam and Eve. So the word, I'll just note, the man knew his wife Eve. So the word know is Hebrew yada, and that's an intimate knowing. So it often is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. So intimately do a husband and wife know each other, that offspring result. It's interesting, in the Hebrew Bible, it also made the point that the word in the Hebrew text can also be translated in the past tense, that now the man had known his wife Eve, which would maybe imply that they shared that intimacy prior to the fall, actually, so that already they were expecting a child, didn't know it yet, but regardless. So could it be, had known his wife Eve. So questions that occurred to you as we were going through that?
So, they both bring offerings, so it's hard to understand why is God upset with Cain?
Yeah.
I read something somewhere where they said basically Abel brought the first, because he brought the first flock, and that's
Mm-hmm.
the best, and that's what you're supposed to sacrifice, bring your very best to God, and that Cain just brought an offering from the ground, that wasn't
Right.
as good, or that's.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's clear in the narrative that God is playing favorites, right? He definitely gives approval to one child, but not to the other. And anybody that has experienced a human condition for very long, you know what happens if a parent prefers one child over another, or if a teacher in a classroom has favorite students and that becomes evident to the whole class. What does it create? It creates a dynamic of resentment. And so this is exactly what is set up here. And it's interesting because there are probably some historical backdrops. One historical backdrop is that Cain is a tiller of the soil, and Abel is a keeper of the sheep. Israel is a pastoral people, so they are shepherds, they keep sheep. So there was a tension in the ancient world sometimes between shepherds and tillers of the soil, gardeners, because they were all fighting for the same land. We've planted a garden here, don't let your sheep eat our food. And the shepherds, why are you all, blocking off land that our sheep could be using right now? So the tension between two different styles of life. And there's kind of a subtle nod here. The shepherds are better. Offering God, the offering of the sheep is better than offering vegetables. So there may be an historical backdrop there to that effect. The more important thing is it also begins to point to something that we're going to see throughout Genesis. We'll see it come up again and again and throughout the Old Testament. And it's also part of human condition, which is this whole sense of sibling rivalry. When brothers or sisters begin to compete with one another, sometimes bad things happen. And it's very interesting that the older son is not the one who is, in a sense, favored in this narrative. And we're going to see that again and again throughout the book of Genesis. And this is in a culture where the firstborn always has precedence. So in the ancient world, the firstborn was the most important, and over again, God seems to say, let's not pick the firstborn, let's get the younger son. And focus on the younger, like David and his many brothers. No, you don't judge by appearances, God says. I've chosen the youngest one. So there seems to be a countercultural effort on the part of Israel to say, it's not the ones we often pick at the top of the list who matter most to God, but the younger ones. And some of the texts as we go through Genesis are, at least they did for me when I first read them, are almost make you want to fight for the oldest. So when you get to the story of Jacob and Esau, for example, I mean, Esau's the great hunter. He's supposed to be the one receiving the blessing from his father. And Jacob is a deceiver and a liar and a cheat, and he gets the blessing instead. And you're like, what? You're going to let that liar and cheater get the blessing instead of, the hunter whose dad really loved? So, there are elements about the story of the narrative that definitely disturb the hearer or the reader. And this is one of the first elements that it starts raising the question, why, is this happening? The more important point is, and we'll never answer the question about why God, in the end, really favored one offering over the other, except for those conjectures I've just made. The more important point is what goes on inside of Cain, which he allows his envy and his anger and his hatred for his brother to consume him. And the more important theological point is, in this little text, is yes, these negative tendencies are always going to be part of your human condition. They're lurking at the door, but you have freedom still. You can say no to those urges if you choose. It's kind of a warning in the Hebrew text. Be careful of these dangerous urges that could lead to something terrible. And it's fraught with tension. We know it's going to be bad, right? All right, questions? I saw their hands coming up. Yes.
But Yahweh in verse 7, is real clear to him, saying, don't do this, don't sin. You can still master him, but don't sin. This is going to be.
It's an admonition.
Going to be really bad.
Don't fall for this.
And yet Cain goes, I'm going to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. It's another act of willful disobedience.
But the Hebrew Bible read it a little bit differently.
There is uplift if you do not do the right. Sin couches at the door, its urges toward you, yet you can be its master.
You can be its master.
Right? You have the ability to say no to that.
And that to me is a little more positive than you must master it.
Right.
It's
Right.
more
You
encouraging.
can be its master.
You can do this.
This can be done.
Cain sounds like a creature, like an animal outside the door,
Mm-hmm.
waiting.
Mm-hmm. It's lurking. Yeah, good. Good insights. Of course, most of us know this is one of the most famous stories of the Old Testament. The stories of creation, the stories of the original fall in the garden, and this story are three of the most famous from the book of Genesis. So what happens next? I'll read again from the Hebrew text. Cain said to his brother Abel. It's interesting, some ancient texts don't have what he said. Other ancient versions add the word, come, let us go out into the field, which are sort of required by the context. And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. Wow. The Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? The word Abel, by the way, is Hebel, close to the Hebrew word for a breath. So Abel is like a breath. He doesn't last very long. The name Cain means spear. So you can imagine the spear popping that breath of wind. And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Then God said, what have you done? Hark, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Therefore you shall be more cursed than the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall become a ceaseless wanderer on earth. Anybody want to do the New American there real quick? Let's hear what the New American Text.
Cain said to Abel his brother, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And then the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand."
All right, interesting. Several notes here. The blood itself, the seed of life in the person, is spilled into the ground. And so it's the blood that cries out. It's interesting, in the Christian tradition, and the Christian tradition is always looking back at the ancient Jewish tradition, and it's seeing everything that happens to Jesus through the lens of that ancient Hebrew tradition. So in the New Testament, it will say that there is blood that cries out more eloquently than that of Abel's, and that is the blood of Christ poured out for us on the cross. So the blood speaks, calling out more eloquently than the first blood ever shed upon the face of the earth. One thing to note, when I talked about the turn of Adam and Eve from the Lord God, that they were acting not as God created them to live, and thus they experienced negative consequences, including division from each other. It's her fault. This woman you put here with me. We see the ripple effect already, don't we? What's it led to now? Murder. And in a sense, is the Hebrew text telling us that anytime a human being murders another, we're always murdering a brother or sister. We're all connected as family in the human family. So there is no murder in a sense that is not fratricide, that we're not killing a sibling when we kill another human being. That's the kind of the subtext underneath it. Don't you recognize that this is your brother? Your brother's blood is crying out. And of course, Cain's retort to God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" So the rest of the Bible, in a sense, is the answer to that question, isn't it? Which, of course, we are each other's keepers. We have a grave moral responsibility to each other. That's the whole foundation of the law of God in the Old Testament. So the very question itself is, in fact, an incrimination of Cain. Yes, you are responsible for your brother. And it will also fast forward us, and again, to a New Testament narrative when, remember, the scholar of the law goes to Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus quotes to him, or depends which gospel you're in, or he quotes back to Jesus, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, your neighbor as yourself." In Luke's gospel, the question is, well, and who is my neighbor? So he wants to know who do I have to love and who do I not have to love? Who fits in the category? And Jesus, of course, tells the famous story of the Samaritan who is the outsider, certainly not my neighbor, and he's the one who does good to the person in the ditch. And Jesus turns the question around and says, who is neighbor to the person in the ditch? So not who is my neighbor that I have to love, but who turned out to be the neighbor. The neighbor turned out to be the person that you weren't going to include in the neighborhood of love. So it's an interesting paradox. Just like Cain was not going to include his responsibility toward his brother. Notice also the question of God. Where is your brother? Where is he? What does that remind you of from a couple of weeks ago? What was the first question God asked? Yeah, to Adam. When he had turned, he says, "Adam, where are you?" And Adam's reply is, "I was hiding in the garden because I was afraid of you." So Adam had a more fundamental honesty, but it's a similar kind of question. Where is your brother? It's a question to stir the conscience. And Cain doesn't pass the test very well. It's also interesting that Cain is the one who tills the soil. That's his approach to life. And now that's going to be even worse than it was before. Yeah, that's going to be much more cursed now. You're not going to be able to farm anywhere, buddy. In fact, you're going to wander everywhere on the planet. No hope for you, So it's interesting. Let's continue with verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Since you have banished me this day from the soil, and I must avoid your presence and become a restless wanderer on earth, anyone who meets me may kill me. In the ancient world, it was almost worse to be exiled from your home community than to be murdered, to be killed through capital punishment. Because when you were set loose on the world, you were vulnerable. You had no longer your family or your tribe or your kin to connect with you, to care for you, and protect you. You're a stranger in the world, you're endangered. You're very vulnerable to being victimized and killed by the strangers out there. Also, people who think that Genesis 1 through 11 are literal stories, the funny question that always comes up is, well, who's out there to kill you? I thought there was only your mom and dad. You killed your brother, so, who are all these people out there going to kill you, So it presumes that there's already a world of people out there beyond Adam and Eve, so.
I think it's just interesting that he says, behold, you have driven me this day away from the ground, and from thy face I shall be hidden. So he recognizes that from now on, he's estranged from God. I mean,
That's a real alienation, yes.
horrible thing.
Yeah. Which is similar to the consequence of our first parents when they were afraid to be around God anymore and hid themselves in the garden and covered themselves. So that sense of shame propelled them. Now it's interesting, the Lord said to him, I promise, if anyone kills Cain, 7-fold vengeance shall be taken on him. So even though Cain has killed his own brother, God is not going to let anybody kill Cain. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who met him should kill him. God, in a sense, puts on Cain a protective sign. You're not to harm this one. What does that remind you of from the 2 weeks ago? A protective mark. It's like at the end, God clothing Adam and Eve. Even though they had experienced the consequences, God clothed them. He covered over their shame. So God says, okay, I'm going to protect you. Even though there are these consequences, I put my protective mark over you. You'll be kept safe from being murdered. So that's I think it's a hint of the Lord's hesed, his heartfelt mercy, his tender compassion.
Do you think it also teaches us that we're not supposed to seek retribution or vengeance?
Yes, I do think that. Yes, and we're going to see that in a moment in the biblical text when it gets quoted back to God in a destructive way or to others. It says, Cain left the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Remember, our first parents were already exiled from the garden with a flaming sword, the circling sword, and the cherubim that prevented their return. They had to go east. So Cain has to go even further to the east. So he's even further away from the garden, from the harmony that God created human beings for. Then in verse 17, Cain knew his wife, same word that Adam had with Eve. So again, there's people there already, a woman he's got as his wife. She conceived and bore Enoch, and then he founded a city and named the city after his son Enoch. What's the subtext here? So Cain, that evil man who killed his brother, he made that first city too. This is a community telling a story that think that big cities are not so good for you. Right? They're the result of that guy who turned away and killed his brother. Those big cities are trouble. Think of Babylon, that big city that hauled us off into exile, from our wonderful place in Jerusalem in the Holy Land. So, to Enoch was born Irad, Irad begot Mahuyael. So you get here now our first, what is called the Toledot, kind of an expression of the generations, how they're connected together. And this is one version. We're going to see a slightly different version with the same or similar names in the next chapter. This is probably still from the hand of the ancient old epic that we talked about. So the hand of the Yahwist is at work here still. That's all the way since the second creation story through the fall, through the story of Cain and Abel, all the way to this point. This is probably the old epic narrative that's unfolding here. Look,
Excuse me, as I said, there are almost without any other context, plenty of other people involved.
right.
Cain's wife,
First city, yes, exactly. Yep, Cain's wife. Exactly.
Why would they not explain where all these people?
Good question. Mary Beth, I'm not sure.
Well, don't you figure that Adam and Eve had to have more than 2 children?
Well, they hadn't had him yet. They're about to have another son soon.
Oh.
By the name of Seth. He's coming along.
Right, but I would think, I mean, they had to have, if they're gonna procreate the whole world,
So,
they had to have children. Maybe they're not named, but there had to be a lot of other children besides 3.
they've been very busy in the garden. Yes, okay. It will talk about, as we go further in, about the fertility of these ancestors and having numerous children. When it talks about their length of age, when you live around 1,000 years, you got plenty of time to make lots of kids. So. But you know, the biblical text is not primarily focusing on that. It's again the theological truths underneath it, which it's trying to convey, which is the effect of sin, turning from God, and the ripple effect it's having on our beloved humanity. So, but then you go to verse 19, and a lot of Genesis has these little explanations for where things come from, and you see a taste of that. Lamech, by the way, verse 19, took to himself 2 wives. Notice that Adam took only one, Cain took one. Lamech will take 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, the name of the other was Zillah. Polygamy was common in the ancient Near Eastern world, and it was in Israel as well early on. So, but you got the sense at the beginning that that was not what God intended, you know, because he said, you know, that's why a man leaves his father and mother, clings to his wife, and the 2 become one flesh. So you could see in a way that the sign that Lamech now is choosing 2 wives instead of 1 may be a ripple effect of the effects of sin, just like all these other things are. And in fact, then we get some explanatory notes. Ada bore Jabal, was the ancestor of those who dwell in tents and live with the herds. So that's where we're getting explanations for all these different kinds of people come from. The name of his brother was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. That's where musicians began. As for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, who forged all implements of copper and iron. So you get your coppersmiths and your ironsmiths. So they're kind of giving you a little explanatory footnote on how these professions arise on the earth. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now listen to what Lamech says in verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me. Why did he kill somebody? Because I got wounded. Little slight offense, I killed him. And a lad for bruising me, a boy, not even mature, bruised me. I killed him too. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then let Lamech be 77-fold. So what does he do? What was this a sign of? The darkness of sin is intensifying. He just starts killing people for no good reason, and then he says, and you better not kill me or you'll be avenged 77-fold. He's kind of turning that caring statement of God on its head, in a sense. So again, and then now we hear about the 3rd son of Adam and Eve. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, meaning God has provided me with another offspring in place of Abel. For Cain had killed him, and to Seth in turn a son was born, and he named him Enosh. It was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name. So we got the explanations of the other professions, but the first ones to call in the name of the Lord don't come from Cain, they come from the 3rd son, Seth. So the better son is the one who begins to invoke the Lord by name. The funny thing is, that's probably not really true, because the sacred name of God was really not revealed until Moses heard it at the burning bush. So this is kind of a retrojection back in time of something that really waited for the era of Moses himself.
But what exactly did that mean? At that time, men began to call upon the name of the Lord.
It's prayer. That means they were praying.
They were praying, so they recognized that God was God.
Right. There was a form of prayer going on. But calling on the Lord by name means using the sacred name of God. So they don't say they called on God by name, Elohim, but they use the tetragrammaton, those four great consonants.
So going back to where God was communicating with Cain, do we assume that now they're just praying to him instead of, like, when I'm reading this story, I'm picturing Cain and God talking. But now, we're just a few verses later, now they're just praying to God.
First time they start praying to God. They're just saying all these things had a beginning. And we want you to know that people started praying as a result of Seth, the third son, his descendants. All right, now we'll go into chapter 5. And notice a subtle shift in tone here. So I'm reading it. Tell me what you notice in terms of that subtle shift in tone. This is the record of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. And when they were created, he blessed them and called them man. What does that remind you of? Those few verses. The first creation story. So we've left behind now the old epic. We're back into the same hand that wrote chapter 1 of Genesis. So you could skip from the end of chapter 1 almost and jump to this point from the same hand. Same vocabulary, if you notice. When God created man, he created him in the likeness of God. So remember, the likeness, image and likeness of God come from chapter 1, not chapter 2. Male and female, that phrase together created in the likeness of God. The use of the word God, Elohim, rather than the Lord. The blessing of them, calling them. Remember in chapter 1, God blessed them, God blessed things, God called things by name. And then we start getting these ages. When Adam had lived 130 years, he begot a son in the likeness after his image, and he named him Seth.
Okay, now that's interesting too, because Adam was made in the likeness of God, in
Yes.
his own image, but now the generations are in the image of their parents.
Right, and the key here theologically is when we hear in chapter 1, God creates human beings, male and female, in the image and likeness of God. When you hear that Seth now is born of Adam and Eve, that he is in the likeness of Adam, it's meant to say that the original image and likeness of God in the human person is now being handed on through procreation. So this image, this likeness to God, this image, is being handed on through procreation. So all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. It flows from God through every new generation, every new conception, in a sense. And after the birth of Seth, Adam lived 800 years and begot sons and daughters. And now we got all the rest of these people coming onto earth. All the days that Adam lived came to 930 years, then he died. So I could put the chart on the board, but we'll go through the list. There are 10 of them. Adam lived to be 930, Seth 912 years, Enosh 905, Kenan 910, Mahaliel 895, Jared 962, Enoch 365, and Methuselah 969. He's the oldest one. in the group. Did you ever hear that phrase when you were a kid? Well, he was as old as Methuselah, right? That's where that comes from, right? So nobody lived longer than Methuselah, 969 years old. Now it's interesting, I mentioned to you all that this narrative of the generations is meant to connect Adam all the way down to Noah. So we're connecting together what we call primeval history. We're showing that from the creation of the world to the great flood, there is this 10 is kind of a perfect number. Once you reach 10, you've run out of fingers. So this is the connection between creation and flood. And this is in the hand of the priestly author who wrote chapter 1. So these great ages are meant to denote a period of time in human history when things were different than historical history, when long ages occurred. And it's borrowed from and modified from things like the Sumerian king list that Israel would have known about when this was written, which lists the ages of their kings, and they lived to be things like 18,500 years old all the way to 43,200 years. So the Sumerian kings lived to be tens of thousands of years old. So the Hebrew epic is not quite so exaggerated or dramatic. It does give a sense of majesty. It's longer, but it's not infinitely long. Tens of thousands. One little note, it will say, and I'm not sure what your translation says, but it gives all the ages of these folks, and then it says, then he died, right? All right, notice though Enoch, did you notice the exception there in that list of 10? Now, verse 21, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he begot Methuselah. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enoch came to 365 years. It's interesting, Enoch stands out as a figure who doesn't live as long as the rest in the list, but the numbers are very symbolic. He lived the number of years that there are days in the year, in the solar year. So it's kind of like there's something about him that makes him already exceptional by the numerical significance of those years. And then it says, Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, for God took him. What does the New American Bible say?
That's pretty much, that's what mine says.
Or God took him. So it's interesting. It does not say he died. So was there something exceptional about Enoch? The Jewish rabbinic tradition has stories about ancestors that something happened at the end of their life that was different, and Enoch is the first one. It doesn't say he died, but he walked with God. So did God take him? Remember, in those days, when you died, there was no afterlife like we think about it today, but you just went to this shadowy place called Sheol, underneath the earth. And you didn't really know anybody there or know God. You just kind of were a shadow of your former self. But Enoch was taken by God. The second great figure who doesn't end his life in a typical way is Elijah, but at the end of his life is taken up into the heavens in a flaming chariot. And then the third one, even though it says Moses died, it has this kind of strange illusion because it says, but nobody knows where he's buried, though. We've not been able to locate a grave for him, which kind of makes you, the rabbinic tradition, wonder, was he the third figure, taken to God at the end? So these great, curious figures.
The phrase that Enoch walked with God is twice.
Yes, which is kind of,
Somehow that seems.
there's something important about that walking with God. That's what we're created for. He lives the days of the solar year, he walks with God, and he doesn't die. He is taken by God at the end. So there's probably more to that than we even know today in the telling, because it's different than the others.
I have the NIV, and some of the things I'm looking here at interpretation says that God gave people longer lives so that they'd have time to fill the earth. Then there's another that says, first of all, they lived longer because the human race was genetically pure. We didn't have diseases then. Then there's a fourth.
So those editors who wrote that Bible are trying to explain
Right.
from a literal point of view.
Yes, and there's another
Yeah.
that
right? I think the key is that they're borrowing the tradition of their Sumerian neighbors of having these grand ancestors who lived a long time to show their greatness is probably the most important thing. Also notice Lamech again. He shows up in this priestly chapter as well. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he begot a son and named him Noah, saying, "This one will provide us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands out of the very soil which the Lord placed under a curse." After the birth of Noah, Lamech lived 595 years and begot sons and daughters. And he lived to 777 years, which in the Bible would be a perfect number. So this is a different tradition. Then he died. And when Noah had lived 500 years, he begot the three important sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So from those three, all the rest of the earth will come. We'll hear later on. So
is that the same Lamech who said, if you kill me, it's going to be 777 times more?
seems like it's interesting how these names show up in both chapters, and they're very similar to one another. One is from the old epic narrative probably, and this is more the priestly hand. So there may be some common connection with a different spin on their persons, especially in Lamech's case.
Maybe they didn't have Junior and third.
That was that other Lamech, the good twin, yeah.
Well, this Lamech was the son of Methuselah, his second one. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of.
Yeah, and if you go back to chapter 4 and read those ancestors, there are so many names that are similar. You have a Methuselah, you have a Mehujael, you have an Enoch. You have similar names. So it's almost like both different narratives borrow from the same tradition of names, but they come out so slightly differently.
To her point, in verse 25, it says, when Methuselah was 187 years old, he fathered Lamech. Well, in the earlier text, Lamech was already there. So I think it's almost
Two separate sources.
Junior.
but Junior was, 900 years later or something.
Probably two separate
Yeah.
narrative traditions woven together now.
But also even now, aren't there names that come down through families?
Over and over again, yes.
Over and over again in the same family?
Well, and not even in the same family, but even in the same cultural milieu. Look at even the New Testament, how many Marys there are, how many Jameses there are. There's so many, how many Johns there are. You have a hard time keeping up because they used all the same names over and over again. Now, chapter 6, we're going to run into some, and again, what you're seeing is the ripple effects of sin. So we saw the original turning from God in the garden. We saw the effects on Cain and Abel. And now chapter 6 is going to show that even more. Someone want to read the beginning of chapter 6, verses 1 through 7 or 8.
The wickedness of mankind. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, but his days shall be 120 years. And Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
All right, so that strange story at the beginning of chapter 6, the point of it in this current context in Genesis is to show how bad things have gotten. Now even heavenly beings, the sons of God, are coming down on earth and having intercourse with women, and the result is you have these giants that have been conceived that are wandering the face of the earth. So this is a grave disordering of the way things ought to be. You shouldn't be having heavenly beings having intercourse with human beings. And so these grotesque giants are created. So Israel had heard stories about giants that existed before their time, and they're giving us again an etiology and explanation for where those giants came from. Well, it was something unnatural. It was those sons of God, those angels, having intercourse with human beings that produced those giants. And they reappear, by the way, in the book of Numbers when Israel is about to go into the land of promise. They're sent in to look, and they said, the descendants of those giants were living in that land. They're giant. They made us look like little grasshoppers. That's what we look like to ourselves. So they were afraid to go into the land of promise because they were spreading rumors now that the descendants of those giants are living in our land. So they appear at other points also in the biblical narrative. But the key point is, look how bad things are getting. Now, all manner of, a depraved thing is happening on the planet. And finally, the result is, and the Hebrew Bible says, and the Lord regretted that he made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. I love the poetry of that. Jim, you have the Jerusalem, right? What does that one say?
Yahweh saw that human wickedness was great on earth, and that human hearts contrive nothing but wicked schemes all day long.
And verse 6?
Yahweh regretted having made human beings on earth, and was grieved at heart.
Okay, so sadness, grief at heart. So it's, you get the sense, and this is probably again from the Yahwist, we're out of the priestly author again, going back to that narrative of Adam and Eve turning in the garden. Now I'm sorry that I've made you. I'm just going to wipe you all out now. However, you get this note of promise. But Noah found favor with God. The word Noah in Hebrew, spelled backwards, is favor. So it's a play on the words. So even though human beings are backwards right now, God is going to find favor in this righteous Noah on the face of the planet. All right. Questions that occur. We're about to move into the flood narrative. Or observations.
These are stories that were written down to explain why things are the way they are. I kind of wonder why there's so much ancestry.
The ancestry toledots are usually about showing connections, relationships.
To other people that survived.
Right. In other words, when you're telling the story, like when I'm telling this story today, I'll say, I went downtown to the country music festival a few years ago, and I ran into Father Mike. You know Father Mike, he was the pastor here. Remember, his brother Ed was a Christian brother out in Memphis. And then you start showing all the connections. It's a way of establishing relationship and connection. So when you're telling the stories, you have to show all the ways that the pieces fit together.
Sort of give it some credibility for reference purposes.
And in fact, right after this, after the flood, we're going to see what Israel will do in the end of chapter 9 after the flood. Is it's going to tell us all the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. And what they do is, and I'm going to make a photocopy for you next week, but the whole earth for them was right around the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. So every people that they knew are going to get included in that list. So they're basically going to show you where all their known nations of the world came from, which is from those 3 sons of Noah after the flood. So And it identifies locations. And the evil son is the father of Canaan, those wicked people that we've been struggling with as a people for centuries. And they're into sexual perversion, and you're going to see how they came by that honestly. Because their father, Canaan's father, was the one who looked at Noah when Noah got drunk after the flood. And he went in and saw he was naked, and he must have made fun of him. Whereas the other two good sons walked backwards with the blanket and covered their father rather than. So, disrespect for one's parents. Something about this is sexually out of sorts. Those Canaanites, they've always been that way. You know that. So. No, yes.
So, I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on this giant thing.
Yes, those giants.
Like, how did
And
I
they
miss
feel
this
him.
all my years?
Right.
But
Those
so when you're
giants.
saying, like, my version says the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful.
Mhm.
And so the sons of God were talking about angels?
So in the Old Testament, when the term sons of God is used, it's describing the heavenly court in the highest heavens where the Lord God dwells, the court that is around God there. We call them angels today, the spiritual beings who are surrounding God in heaven.
And so then where my brain's not connecting the dots is we just said that these people didn't know about heaven. They just thought when you die you're in like a shadowy land. So how do they come?
Oh, they believed in heaven, but heaven wasn't our destination at death. Heaven was the place where God dwelt with the angels in heaven. They believed in heaven, but just not as our destination when we die.
Does that make sense? Because in the very beginning it said he created
Yeah,
heaven and earth.
we return to the dust from which we came. Yeah.
Do you think these angels or these spiritual beings were like visible? Like the way I'm trying to picture it in my head, like we're just humans, and then these spiritual beings were within the humans, and that's how they created giants.
So, I mean, obviously it's a legendary story trying to explain the spread of sin. Yeah. It's a legendary story. I mean, there weren't really giants, right? And spiritual beings can't have intercourse with human beings and produce offspring, right? That's not possible. Right? So
If it's not literal, like what's it trying? It's just trying to explain.
it's trying to show you how bad things got. Yes. The boundaries between heaven and earth were violated. That should never happen. This is something that's disordered here in creation.
Until later on.
Well,
Until by grace we're drawn into the divine
who were
life.
the Nephilim? Because I guess I thought those were the giants.
That's what
Yes, those were the offspring from the sons
they
of
were,
God
the
and the women. The Nephilim, yes, were the offspring. The giants were the offspring.
So there really were giants.
Yeah, those giants, that were wandering around. These big giant people,
Giant people.
Yeah, and one of them was like Goliath. He made David look like a little shepherd boy, which he was. So, yeah. Okay. No, it's good. You're asking great questions. So.
But the mighty men that they're talking about too, is that a reference to later when they bring up mighty men?
Yeah, exactly. So, it's, Israel would have heard stories of the great men that lived of yore. Well, that's where they came from. They were results of all
It's
those.
kind of a reference to that, you think?
Yes.
That's probably where
Yes.
these fighters and these.
Right. Those great people that we've heard about, and our myth and the myths of the cultures around us. Yeah, we know where they came from.
The men are renowned.
Like when they describe the great sea monsters, they probably are referring to, these sailors came back telling stories of seeing these big giant animals under the water. We would call them whales today, and great white sharks and things, So,
Wasn't it at this time that the Lord regretted making the human beings and what was going on?
yes, precisely. So yeah, it's after this terrible disordered boundary violation between the heavens and earth that God is really sorry he created us now. Now this is not going well. This experiment did not go well. Let's clean it up. Let's start over.
Shouldn't have given him free will.
And it's interesting because we're moving toward the great flood now. And so what will happen, we'll read the whole narrative, but you're going to see that the world gets flooded again. It's like that original, remember the tohu wabohu that watery mess before God spoke and said, let there be light, that messy chaos, it's kind of like that messy chaos is going to return. It's going to wash away everything. All the floodgates are going to open up. Those in the dome of the sky and also those down in the bottom. So the great subterranean waters are all going to come flooding up. The waters from above. This is a primeval chaos returning. But what's at the heart of it is this ark that God has Noah build. And so Noah and his wife and the 3 sons of Noah and their wives, those 8 persons, are going to enter the ark with every sort of animal on the face of the earth and all the birds. So that God will have a way to recreate the human family and recreate all the things he created in Genesis chapter 1. So I do have some reflection questions for tonight, but I wanted to give my homework assignment first before we talk about the reflection questions. So what I would like for you to do before next week, we're going to meet the next 2 Tuesday nights. Do read from where we stopped tonight. So start with chapter 6, verse 9, where we meet Noah. This is the line of Noah. And read all the way through till after the flood. So go all the way through chapter 9. And in fact, go all the way through 10. So chapter 6 through 10, read that before next time. And when you read the flood story, really pay attention. Many scholars believe that the flood story as it now stands in the book of Genesis is kind of a blending of 2 different sources that get merged together. And when you're reading it, you start getting a little confused, like, wait a minute. Did the flood last 40 days or did it last 150 days? You know, wait a minute, was there only 1 pair of each animal or were there 7 pair of the clean and 1 pair of the unclean? And you'll see the typical vocabulary shift from the Lord, which is sort of like your old epic narrative, or God, Elohim, which is Mother Priestly. It's probably 2 narrative traditions that have been woven together in the current text. So that's why when you're reading, you're scratching your head like, wait, 40 days or 150 days? Well, it's probably 2 different sources that they've woven together a bit. So, but pay attention when you read about it and ask yourself again, what are the questions that occur to me as I'm reading the text? Write those questions down so you can bring them next week and we can talk about them. And we'll be going into the flood narrative next week along with the generations that show up afterward. Noah is a very key figure. He is kind of a new Adam. This is where God's favor will be shown after the chaos is subsiding and the waters go down again. All right, so groups of 6 or 8, and I've got reflection sheets.